bit late in the afternoon, but we'll try to keep you entertained. So the name of this talk is the Paradox DLC model, planning for the long term. And the astute among you might notice that there has been a change of speakers. I was supposed to do this talk together with Johan Andersson, but unfortunately he had to cancel pretty much at the last minute. So instead, my esteemed colleague Shams Jorjani will be jumping in and doing this together with me. All right, so does everyone know who we are? What is Paradox? No one? Some of you guys, anyway.
So I can take this off. Again, thanks everyone for being here. So we're going to go through this presentation and we'll be talking a little bit about our DLC model, and hopefully towards the end we'll do a bit of a Q&A. You can kind of ask us if we have our heads screwed on straight or what the hell's going on, and tell us if this makes sense or not. But one of the reasons why we're here is that we get a fair amount of shit for our business model, to put it mildly.
To be frank.
If you go and check out any of our user scores on Steam right now, you'll see a lot of thumbs down, and all they write is the DLC model. So that's part of the reality, but we also have an equal amount of people that defend it and support it quite a bit, and we have an even greater amount of people who just buy the games and DLC to hell and back. So we're not here to defend the DLC model, but we're here to explain and elaborate a bit about why the business model looks like this, and to shed a bit of light behind it. And hopefully there's a bit of takeaways and that you guys can take with you as you go on and make a ton of money, hopefully, off of your DLC plans.
Right, so it's kind of a two-part talk. We're talking a little bit about the business model, and that's more your area, I guess. And I'm going to talk about our design practices and how we decide how to do features and what kind of features we do in these expansions. So, my name is Henrik Fahraeus. I'm a game director at Paradox. These days, I usually do, or mostly do, game design, creative supervision, and product management. But I've had my hand in our games since 2001 as programmer, scripter, and all kinds of things. And I'm probably best known for Crusader Kings 2 and Stellaris most recently. Yeah, so.
Cool. My name is Shams Jorjani. I've been with Paradox about 8 years. I work on the publishing side, so I'm very much the corporate douchebag in that sense. So where Henrik makes the games fun for you, I'm on the other side doing other things, and we'll get to that. I've done mostly just about everything at Paradox, from marketing, production side, but most notably I've been in charge of our games portfolio for the past 7 years. So all the bad stuff we've released and signed, that's my fault, and all the good stuff I've been just partially responsible, you could say. I've also been part of the management team, and I'm very much in charge of running the part of the business models stuff. So I could do like a 5-hour talk about the business model straight up today. So I was happy to jump in, but I'll take it all from here. Thanks. So, Paradox 2. How many here have played a Paradox game? Please keep your hands up. Fantastic. How many of you have played a Paradox game for more than 10 hours? How many have played a Paradox game for more than 100 hours? More than 500 hours? More than 1,000 hours? More than 2,000 hours? More than 3,000 hours? Okay. So.
Awesome.
Fantastic. First of all, thank you. Secondly, this tells the rest of you who haven't played Paradox game, who hasn't played a Paradox game? Oh, there's a few of you. Okay, poor people. So, Paradox games have, since their inception, always been niche games. One of our unofficial slogans has been, a game for everyone is a game for no one, essentially. And we've created these very hardcore sandbox procedural kind of games that have been very much focused on historical settings. This is where Paradox started. Paradox made these historical games and worked with regular publishers. This was in 2004, before there was digital distribution, before Steam. So we worked with Atari, and Atari published our games the same way they would have published any old action game. And after a while, we realized these guys have no idea how we weirdo strategy historical gamers behave, talk about games, and enjoy them. We have to stop working with that publisher and become our own publisher. So many of you may be standing in front of that challenge right now. Do I self-publish or not? We asked ourselves that question in 2004. There was a gentleman called Fredrik Wester, who's now our CEO, who came in and presented a business plan to the people who owned Paradox then. And he said, you got to become your own publisher. They looked at the plan and said, get out of here, we're closing everything down. And they actually closed everything down and gave it to Fred, who bought the company for 1 Swedish crown. From that point on, Paradox started becoming a self-published company. And these games did fairly well. We had our niche audience, they cost next to nothing to make, and we kind of scrambled to survive during those harsh years. And after a while, we kind of had a bit more success and decided, hey, we're pretty good at publishing these weirdo niche games. How about we find other weirdo niche games and publish those? And that's what we started doing. But we had a shoestring budget, so most of those games were actually not that amazing. So over the years, we've released about 100, 120 games. Most of them are not amazing. That doesn't mean that people didn't work really hard on a lot of these games, but we had to do what we had to do to survive. So that's a kind of a background that Paradox has had. Nowadays, we've grown quite a bit. We consider ourselves very much still a niche publisher in that sense, but we've had a lot of success. Depending on what AAA game is failing currently on Steam, we'd be considered top 5 or top 10 publisher, depending on how you do it. And we've done that by sticking to our guns and kept doing those kind of really weird niche strategy games. Over the years, we've branched out, and sometimes we've done stuff that's been more mainstream, like Magica, and that did fairly well, and that allowed us to keep pouring more resources into our core business, which was the strategy games. So nowadays, we have about 200 internal developers who are making strategy games of different sorts, and then we do a lot of publishing worldwide. And we'll get back to the type of what that essentially is meant for the design side of things. Most recently, we released Surviving Mars last week, which went well. We also quite recently bought Triumph Studios, a Dutch studio who makes the Age of Wonder series. And 2.5 years ago, we bought White Wolf from CCP, who were not doing that much with the IPs. So we're big fans of vampires as well. So over the years, we've kind of developed a secret sauce, and it's not so secret, essentially, because we talk about it all the time. But we have a basic formula for what we consider is a Paradox game. And as I've kind of tried to maintain focus for the portfolio over the years, we try to stick to these pillars. We feel that these pillars are the thing that makes a Paradox game. And not only that, we think that these games, the games that follow these pillars, fundamentally result in a stronger business model. And this is a really important aspect of this. Most of us, I don't know about you, Henrik, but I started in the games industry because I wanted to make games. And then I ended up not making a single game, of course, but that's how things go. Most of us, our first passion is maybe making games. But then we quickly encounter the realities of making games, which is ultimately it's a business. It's a business and an art, but without paying for your work, it very quickly becomes something else. So Fred, our CEO's main focus has always been building a business, and he's always built a business for the long term. We always view games and our function in the games industry as a marathon, not a sprint. We're quite confident that if we make it to the 10th game, it's probably going to be good. The challenge is to keep to make games so you get to that 10th game. I don't know if anyone here plans on retiring after they make their next game. I don't think so. A lot of us want to keep making games. So we retain focus on what makes the business model kind of works. So we talk a lot about the business model, and it's something that's deeply ingrained into our games. It's a fundamental part of it. And we feel that games that do follow these pillars actually just result in a stronger business model that allows us to make more money. And more money allows us to make more games and better games. We think that these type of games are largely underserved, and we also understand them fairly well. And just briefly, I'm not going to run through them in terrible detail, since most of you are already familiar with the type of games we do. But a Paradox game should be infinitely replayable, ideally. I just checked the numbers yesterday. The median played time for Hearts of Iron 4 is 202 hours. Median play time. If you look at, again, Hearts of Iron, about 34% of everyone who's bought the game has played it more than 100 hours. Half of the people who ever bought Hearts of Iron since it was launched almost 2 years ago still play it once a month. So we have crazy retention numbers, mostly because I don't think those players have anywhere else to go. But so the games need to be infinitely replayable. We want the games to be intellectually challenging in some form. We want them to challenge the mind, not the reflexes, although they do also have that an action component from time to time. We want the games to cater to some kind of creative aspect. We want you to tell us a story in our games rather than us tell you a story. The games are not made beautiful necessarily by graphics, but by the gameplay. And sometimes, so we feel that graphics are there to serve a purpose. They're not the ends themselves. And we like the games to be accessible in some way or form so you can get into them. We fail quite at this often. We also want the games to be something you can nerd out about. If you have real-world knowledge about FLAC 88 cannons, that should help you in the game somehow. A number of games that just I want to show you briefly that we think that really live up to these kind of pillars and we draw a lot of inspiration from and are humbled before the fact that we can learn a lot from these type of games. Literally every single game here that is not currently published by us, and a lot of them aren't, we'd consider Paradox games. It's just failures on my part that I didn't manage to sign Terraria or Hearthstone. That would have been pretty hard. And coming back to the business model, and this is the really important part. So by having a game that somebody can play 1,000 hours in, if you've spent 1,000 hours playing the game, it's probably not going to be that hard for me to convince you to spend $1 more in it. If you look at the average spend you've had over the lifespan of the game, you're getting quite your money's worth compared to most other forms of entertainment. I argue quite heavily, and nobody listens to me again, luckily, that we should put a big, fat, juicy number in the main menu of every single Paradox game, which tells you how much money you spend per hour of entertainment. And I'll dare you to find any other premium game that can beat our numbers. Maybe free-to-play games, but I don't think you can find that on the premium space. So we just see people spend more in games where they are spending more time. It sounds very simple, and it is true. It's harder to make. Games that do not focus on art or games that focus on systems and procedural stuff just get better mileage out of development resources. SimCity 5 had about 80 artists that were working on it. City Skylines was made by a team of 8 people. By not focusing on art, we focus on stuff that gives us more mileage. By having modding in our games, we actually are pushing the costs to other people, which are fans. They create variants of our games. Ultimately, we think that every single game has a Dota or a DayZ locked inside of it somewhere, but we as developers can't find it. It can only be found once it's put in the hands of you players, because you guys are much smarter than we are. I mentioned that already. Actually, duplicate, sorry. We also, by having games that follow this model, actually see also recurring revenues. People come back and spend money over time. People that actually spent 1,000 hours in our games are less likely to go to a competitor as well, because they're locked in because of the sunk cost fallacy or whatever reason. If you invested that much time in the game, you don't want to let go of all that. This is why I still play Magic the Gathering after 20 years. And finally, these games are quite hard to make, which, at least in the grand strategy space, we consider ourselves not having any real competitors. So this has led us to a position where we still keep making niche games, but we know that niche games don't mean small by any means. Our basic philosophy is that if we create something that is very pure and uncompromising, we will create such a satisfactory game experience in the core audience that they can't find anywhere else. And they will, after a while, start talking about the game in terms that you might not recognize. And then other people will actually not maybe relate to the game, but they will relate to the player fantasies. And while the core gameplay is pretty niche, the core fantasies that we have in our games, the player fantasies, ultimately the reasons why people play the games are quite strong. I'll give you a good example. Crusader Kings 2 is about running, a medieval royal house in an obscure part of Europe. The game does not necessarily look that amazing. It's quite hard to play. The game has still sold almost 2 million copies. And the reason for that is that it has a pretty basic and relatable player fantasy, which is to rule as a king or queen. And that's something everyone here has experienced or fantasized about at some point during their childhood. That fantasy is strong. And through shows like Game of Thrones, that fantasy is enhanced and it's there and people can relate to it. Often, other examples is EVE Online, for instance. You hear these amazing stories about EVE Online that people have gameplay experiences. And like, that sounds super cool. I want to experience that, and people try it out. And then it's like doing your taxes for 3 hours, and then you maybe discover that, hey, I like doing my taxes for 3 hours. So one thing we know that niche does not mean small by any measure of the word, as long as we are uncompromising and really try to stick to the basic tenet that a game for everyone is a game for no one. And I'm going to hand it over to Henrik in a bit, but this model has developed over a few years. Henrik will describe what our DLC model looks like today, but in the past, it didn't work this way. We used to release a game, and then 6 months later, we had an expansion, and that more or less replaced the old game. And we did another expansion 6 months later, and that made the last expansion obsolete. So it was a very serial way of approaching things. And we know that our games had a life cycle of about 2-3 years, and then they became obsolete, more or less. So I've harped on about the business model because it's something that drives a lot of the design decisions that we make, and it's one of the fundamental things that ties the company together. And we'll be able to come back and talk about, as we wrap up, on why we think this DLC model is literally the best thing for us as a money-making company, but most importantly, it's the best thing for our fans and the players. People who want more content and DLC from our products are benefited by the fact that we work with our current DLC model compared to the old one. It's quite easy to look at the product page for Crusader Kings and just see that, oh my god, these guys have $270 worth of DLC. They're evil. Well, on the other hand, you could have bought the base game of Crusader Kings in 2012 and never bought a single piece of DLC, and you'd still see multiple updates every year and tons of content for free. So our usual kind of what we say to people is that you don't want the DLC, don't buy it. And that works, it's just in some respects. So I'll hand it over to you now.
Cool, thanks. I'm going to harp on a little bit more about the business model, unfortunately, but stay with me. This is from the perspective of the development studio. So we've already mentioned that our fans are pretty hardcore. They play our games for a very long time, and they used to do that even in the old days with Europa Universalis 2 and Victoria 1 and so on. But we didn't really capitalize on that. So the long tail existed, but we didn't make any money off it, really, which is sad. So we came up with this new DLC model. Instead of every new release of an expansion obsoleting the previous one, they would all be modular. So it's like going into a candy shop and picking up the stuff you like into your little bag. And they would be able to play nice with each other, regardless of the combination of expansions or DLC that you bought. And we thought that a game should have an indefinite life cycle. If people keep playing it, we want to keep supporting it and keeping it fresh and releasing new stuff for it. We thought that, actually at the time we didn't think that, we learned that we can go as high as 50-50 free and paid features when you think of our development time for an expansion and the patch that goes along with it. And that's fine. People will perceive it as one whole experience anyway. So these days we release both expansions and something we call immersion packs or story packs, which are less heavy on the code content. And here is actually the current downloadable content page on Steam for Crusader Kings 2. It's not that bad, actually, because we've come to the realization that we should bundle up our stuff. It used to be like 80 different DLCs there, which was extremely off-putting and hard to navigate. So we've taken some flack for the model, but what I say to everyone is basically that all these DLCs, even if you just buy 1 or 2 of them, will allow us to keep developing and improving the game for an indefinite period, basically, which is great for everyone. So instead of tailing on, tailing off, we're actually tailing on. This is monthly active users for Europa Universalis 4 since, July 2014. And as you can see, it just keeps growing. It's pretty amazing. I don't know if I know any similar game that has a similar curve, to be honest.
Our games models end up having a very similar curve to free-to-play games that are run as games as a service. So our premium games come pretty close to actually just replicating that. We're spending more, I think we're spending like triple the amount we're spending now, today, on Crusader Kings compared to the year before the game was finished for release.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. I mean, these games are getting quite old now, especially Crusader Kings 2, and it still looks like this. So Shams talked a lot about the business case, and from my perspective or studio perspective, it's more like, expansions drive up the monthly active users, no question about that. Old expansions keep selling, so that the base game sales are actually quite eclipsed by all the expansions and DLC that we release. And we want to cater to different types of players, find new demographics and target groups for our existing games. And of course, it gives us some sales and marketing flexibility to do pre-order bonuses and other gimmicks that we can throw out there. And as for that first point, that expansions actually drive up MAU, here's that same graph again with the various expansions and content packs for Europa Universalis 4. And you can see that they coincide quite nicely with all these bumps. Now, there are some other bumps as well, and they are actually sales campaigns and holidays and stuff like that, so there is a reason for them too. And they probably contribute as well in keeping interest and driving up monthly active users. But expansions are extremely effective to get this tail or curve that we like so much. And as for old expansions that they keep selling, here is 2 examples. The Old Gods for Crusader Kings 2. It was released in 2013, and you can see there how many units in thousands that it's sold since then. And we see the same pattern, even better actually, for Europa Universalis 4 with Common Sense. And when you have 15 expansions, that's starting to get to be a lot of money. And we want to cater to different play styles, different types of players. And it's particularly suitable for a game like Crusader Kings 2, which is almost a hybrid between a strategy game and an RPG, in that different expansions can take a different tack. Some of them can be pretty RPG, others can be more internal politics, some are even into the supernatural and fantasy stuff, which is slightly controversial, but appreciated by all our fans. And about sales and marketing flexibility, well, we can whip up things like this, some with more effort than others. And it's quite neat. You can give it away at fan gatherings and stuff like that, since it's all neatly modular and plays nice with the base game. But of course, there's a player case as well. And I already mentioned that I think it's good for players to see their beloved game live pretty much forever, or for a very, very long time at least. And also the fact that they can buy and pick and choose whatever expansions they like. It's just a sad fact that there are so many completionists out there who feel that they have to own everything, and that we are thus, doing a con job or something. It's too bad. So the idea with longevity, anyway, is that games should never feel abandoned. We will keep improving the base experience as long as people keep playing the game and buying our expansions. So even if you don't buy any expansions, we're going to keep it fresh, and people are going to notice that the game is actually getting better. If you come back to it 2 years after stopping playing, it will be a better experience. Right, and the other point was modularity. You buy what you like, and with our model, you can actually try things out in multiplayer because what the host is running, everyone can use. So that's pretty neat as well.
It goes back to learnings from watching our fellow Swedish developers at DICE famously released map packs that divided the player community. So we kind of decided that we want to have inclusive DLCs that allow more people to experience the DLC without dividing the player community.
Yeah, it was also kind of a technical challenge to get that to work, but I think it's a great idea. Right, so let's take a look at the design approach here, because it is quite a challenge to churn out this many expansions and come up with new features that are perceived well by players. And I think that it's all about player perceptions, really. It's not about what the developers want to do. So first off, if you want to do this, you got to have a very solid base game. And the trick there is to make the game feel absolutely complete, even if you don't own any expansions. It's got to have to feel like a complete experience, basically, or it'll come back to bite you. And you're going to have some fun core loops. That's what you should focus your efforts on, making sure that the base game you release has excellent core loops that are addictive and fun. And you can save all those darlings, all the extras for later, because you can rest easy in the knowledge that you will probably release a lot of expansions. Of course, you also need to prepare for that fact. You should think about all the expansions you want to release, or at least the first couple of years. So you should have design outlines for that and the code base to support it. And if you boil it down to two principles, when you design features for expansions that people pay for, principle number one is that they have to be visible. It has to have a visible impact, or people will not understand that you put a lot of effort into it. So no matter how much work you do under the hood, it's not going to be well received unless it's immediately visible. So here's an example of that. We added something called Ages to Europa Universalis 4. And once you install that expansion, you can immediately see in the main interface that there's a little thing there. You're in this age of Reformation, for example. The other main principle is that good expansion features should be atomic in a way. They should be standalone, unentangled, and independent from as many systems as you can possibly make them. This can be very hard, of course, but if you can't make the features atomic and standalone, you should put them in the free patches and updates instead. One big no-no, another tempting thing, as a designer especially, is to add a paid feature that you then want to build on in a subsequent expansion after that. That's going to be very tricky, and you're going to be limiting the number of people who actually can buy and enjoy that second upgrade to those features. So don't paint yourself into a corner. And with that in mind, we have found that there are certain types of features that are excellent material to make paid. First off, features that add new ways of playing, of achieving old goals in a new way. Say that you take territory through military means in the base game, but then you add a way of doing it diplomatically in an expansion as well. Progression is super good as well. If you can add a system where you can level up or gain new ranks, or rank up in some old system, that's also perfect. It's pretty standalone and atomic. And then there's customization stuff, like we made a DLC for Crusader Kings 2. It's a barber shop, basically, where you can change hair and beard of your character. And it's a little thing, but it's kind of cool, and it's extremely standalone and not entangled in anything else. Purely cosmetic. And then there's faction unlocks, which it's not just us doing this. I think other companies have also found that it's perfect for this. And the reason is that there is a risk when you add more features to the game, that you get feature creep, the interface gets cluttered with new things, But if you do faction unlocks, that doesn't happen because it adds a different way of playing the game with mutually exclusive interfaces, basically. And then you can do quality of life UI things, and I have an example of that coming up. So here's an example of a faction unlock. In Crusader Kings 2 on release, you could only play Christians, and that had a distinct playstyle. But then with expansions, we added things like Muslims in Sword of Islam, and with this expansion, the Old Gods, we made it possible to play pagans. And it's a completely different experience. The Christians mostly play nice and abide by diplomatic rules. They have to have a reason to go to war and all that boring jazz. But the pagans, they're all about raiding and pillaging and just declaring war, taking concubines, having a good time. We also added 200 more years to the gameplay, which was quite appreciated. But the cool thing about this is if you don't play as the pagans, it's the same old thing. So the pagans are a different way of experiencing the same game. Here's another example. It's the diplomatic macro planner from Europa Universalis 4. It basically gathers up all diplomacy in one place, and it was very appreciated. So it's a new interface that you get with this expansion, Mandate of Heaven. But it's very separate from everything else. It's just a convenience thing. You don't have to have it. The game works just as well without it, which means that it's standalone and very modular. So a perfect feature for a paid expansion. And there's one more example of progression. In Stellaris, which has a really cool tech system, the technology system in Stellaris is basically a collectible card game almost. So it's very easy to slot in new technologies. And what we did here is basically we added a new layer of late-game technologies for progression and ranking up. And in this case, it's very visible in some cases, like the Planet Destroyers and the Titan-class spaceships. All right, so those are some good types of features that you can actually charge money for. But there are also bad features, and trust me, we've made plenty of these as well, plenty of mistakes. So you can do these things, but the point is you cannot charge money for them. So you shouldn't try to make core gameplay changes that alter the experience for players who have the expansion. That's a big no-no. You shouldn't try to make or charge money for minor improvements. Balance and bug fixes, of course, should be free. And you should not try to make features that mess with 1,000 other features in the game. That's a pretty bad idea. So here's an example from CK2. In Crusader Kings 2, armies are not standing around on the map, and they are mobilized or called up when you need them. So they're peasant levies, essentially. But I thought it would be a really cool idea if the professional troops that actually existed at the time could also be represented in the game somehow, and that as the eras progress, the peasant levies would be phased out, and people would start using retinue troops more. However, while this was well received, it also messed with the core gameplay in significant ways. It's completely upset the balance of warfare, if you had the expansion or not, and it was also a feature that we really wanted to build on in subsequent expansions, but we couldn't because we painted ourselves into a corner. And here's a more recent example, a blitz combat tactic from Hearts of Iron 4, which caused pretty much an uproar on the forums. In itself, it should be pretty suitable as a paid feature, but it was kind of a minor thing. It was one combat tactic among many, and it was perceived that this should have been part of the base game. It was also unfortunate that it was called Blitz. It's pretty iconic for a World War II game to have a Blitz command or combat tactic. So it kind of backfired on us. We've also done some entangled features. This is a system we added in EU4 called Estates. It's basically internal political factions that create gameplay for you as a ruler. You need to keep these political factions happy, or they will start causing you all kinds of troubles. But they can also give you bonuses. The problem with this feature, or one of the problems with it, is that it kind of messes around with every other thing in the game. And whenever we release something new, we have to consider, well, what will happen to the estates mechanic if we do this, etc. So, pretty bad idea. Should have been free. Which brings us to free features. There is nothing wrong with this, and I think we spend at least 50% of our development time actually doing free features. As long as you have a strong theme for your expansion, they are perceived as a whole thing. You know, the free and the paid part make for one experience. And that's also how I see it as a designer. I really ideally want people to kind of mix them up and not know what is free and what is paid. It doesn't really work that way, but you can dream. So free features, using them, you can replace old mechanics that you don't like much. You can mess around with the core gameplay, and people will still perceive, you know, that the game is kept fresh and cool, and you're doing interesting shit. So everything I said was bad in a paid feature, you can probably do as a free feature. There are some other pitfalls that don't have to do specifically with the types of features. You should remember to stick to what the game is. This is also something we've forgotten sometimes. And what is the game? Well, it's partly what we think it should be, what we thought when we created the game originally, but it's also what the players think that the game is. And you know, the biggest mistake you can make is probably add new restrictions on players. Now there is a case to be made that our games, at least CK2, is hard to learn and easy to master. And that's kind of the pyramid upside down, right? So I had the brilliant idea that let's crank up the challenge and make the game a bit harder. So we added defensive alliances and other things to the game that were supposed to crank up the challenge. But people just felt that they'd been put in a straitjacket instead, and that's not a good place to be. So don't mess with agency, the player's freedom to act. And then there's, of course, feature overload and UI clutter. And it's a challenge because it completely contradicts the high visibility requirement of paid features, right? But if you have a lot of visible features, what are you going to end up with? Well, it's going to be a pretty overloaded interface. Another huge mistake is to, as developer, think that, yeah, I like the Black Sheep Turks. You know, we should expand on that experience. It's an awesome faction. But unfortunately, most players will not see it that way. They have their preferences, and we know that there are certain countries are a lot more popular than others. Germany, Prussia, the Confederate States of America, right? The Eastern Roman Empire. All of these are super popular for some reason, don't ask me why. But when we do an expansion about India or something, yeah, no. So just don't go there. It's a sad fact. So what actually, what do players value? Well, initially we thought that, hey, let's look at Steam review scores. That's a great metric. And it was a pretty good metric originally, but then less and less so over time, as there was more and more rage about our DLC model particularly. So there's a correlation between Steam review score and actual revenue, but it's weaker than you might expect. So as designers, we look more at actual revenue now than we do the Steam review scores. And we also came up with a neat little formula or spreadsheet that we employ to estimate the value for money for our expansions. So these are some CK2 expansions, and we've divided up the features into different sizes, and each size gives you a different sort of score. So we then sum up that score, and we divide it by the price point, and then we get a pretty arbitrary value for money, right? It works pretty well. We want that value for money value to be at 2 or above, ideally. But as you can see, some of our more popular expansions are actually way below that, or a bit below that. So Old Gods had 1.8. It still did extremely well. So the flaw with this formula is it doesn't really consider the free features that we release along with the paid ones. I mean, I know for a fact that the Reaper's Due, which didn't really contain that much paid content, it was extremely well received, mostly due to the free stuff, right? So people keep mixing this up, and it's to our advantage, of course. So we're still working on improving this formula or spreadsheet. And now we come to Johan's part of this presentation. So sadly, I'm not going to do it justice, but it has to do with other types of challenges that are not related to design specifically. About the architecture, well, the code base will keep evolving all the time, and that's interesting in many ways, but it's going to help, at least in our position, it helps because we have so many live projects. If you can do a lot of improvements in the engine. We have the Clausewitz engine, and we have a middle layer called Jorjani. And if you can do improvements there, it's going to benefit all the games. And Johan really wanted to stress that you should keep the code simple and readable, and not over-engineer it. And that's very important for us because in our organization we have to move the programmers around a lot, and they need to understand the code pretty much at a glance. So don't get too clever. You also got to keep the code maintainable. And I know one thing he wanted to bring up was a simple little trick. If you have a get function, for example, you can pass along a text string as an argument or pointer to get the tooltip. So you only have one function. You following, Chance?
No.
You only have one function to work with, and you don't have to have a separate tooltip function. And you should try to have a clear programming guideline or standard that everyone follows. As for the technology itself, well, it's a virtual file system. We treat our DLCs exactly like mods. They're pretty much the same thing as far as the game is concerned. They're packages that are treated as modular changes. You can toggle them on or off at load time, which is convenient. So if you buy, House Lords or full plate music or whatever, you can turn it off if you don't like it or if you get tired. And then there's the process, the project management of it all. And it's very important, of course, to plan ahead. You should have the design ready in time. The designers should be, one step ahead all the time. And you should have a scalable UI that is easy to work with and make room for more stuff, because you will add more stuff to the UI. It's guaranteed. And it's important to remember that you have to repay tech debt. We have a pretty aggressive schedule when it comes to releasing these expansions, and we don't have an infinite amount of people. So sometimes we have to cut some corners and accept the fact that we will have to do some hacks and hard-coded solutions. And these accumulate and get worse over time. So it's worthwhile to take some time to catch up. And we usually schedule a couple of weeks in between certain expansions to catch up on our tech debt. Most importantly, though, you need to understand your players. And if you can use reasonable metrics, do so. If you have telemetry, use it. If you don't have telemetry, add it. And you should listen to your hardcore fans. Well, to some degree, I suppose. Don't listen to them too hard, because there are pretty vocal minority. But as long as they keep it constructive and positive, you should listen to their stories and what they tell you. And you will understand them probably if you play the game yourself. And sadly, not all people actually play the game and enjoy it. So how can you expect your players to do so? Right. So if I were to summarize this somewhat unfocused subject, it would be keep your design modular and standalone. And this is for the paid features, of course. And you should think about player perceptions more than the time you spend developing something or how hard or complex it is. The only thing that matters is how players perceive it. So remember to make your features visible and to be perceived as giving high value. And you need to have a maintainable architecture. There's probably something here to add on the business side of things as well.
I think that you touched upon something that's really interesting in the sense that we've built the company by having a very transparent and open and very close dialogue and relationship with a lot of our fans. We try to listen to them. We have our forums that have over 1 million active users. And what's happened over the years is that not only has a lot more people have come into the Paradox ecosystem that are not familiar with the games or everyone has their different types of stories. So the vocal minority is they get a critical mass in their voice. So it's heard in a completely different way today, and it's heard differently because they also have tools which allows them to get heard. So on one hand, I mean, we're getting a lot of complaints on the DLC model. On the other hand, we have more people than ever that not only buy the stuff, but they keep buying it. And, you know, we end up with a silent majority that are in the game, enjoying the features, and not shit posting on the forums. So there's always this balance of trying to find, look, how do we keep in touch with the players and listen to what they have to say and balance that out against what we're doing and what the silent paying majority is doing? Because at the end of the day, they are the people we need to please because they keep paying us. If somebody doesn't agree with some of our practices, it's somewhat hard. I think there's another interesting point that I think we could make as well. I took the kind of point here is that I can't stress enough, and I've said it a million times, but it's really what I love. It's the business model. That games that follow these give us a robust protection from changes in the market. And I'll give you a good example. When Steam rolled out their refund policy, and for those of you not familiar with it, the Steam refund policy said that if you played the game for less than 2 hours, you can refund it, no questions asked. And this was rolled out without informing a single publisher or developer, as far as I know, and nobody I've asked had heard of it before. And they even had a big grace period of 6 months back. You could just refund anything. If you had a game, let's say you had an indie game that was very narrative and story-driven, you could start and finish it in less than 2 hours, you were utterly and completely screwed over by that policy change from Steam's side. It's ultimately a good policy change. It protects the consumer and makes our positions as gamers a lot better, but that developer's business model is completely screwed. And when it comes to a Paradox game, well, good luck getting past the main menu in 2 hours. So it's a silly example of how the business model or the way we do things actually allow us a fair bit of protection from stuff on the outside. I think a lot of us have seen the image of Mona Lisa being cut into small pieces, and they're selling the pieces in separate pieces as an analogy of how games are destroyed today and discrete parts being sold. Pieces that people should be in the game and belong in the game. And I don't want to get into this big discussion about entitlement, but it's something that we end up thinking a lot about and talking a lot about.
It's also feasibility. You know, if that was true, it would take us 10 years to develop a game, and it would look bad at the time we released it.
Yeah, and ultimately, like it's I think that whenever we have a good balance between quality of life improvements that we give away for free and do screw ups where we charge for features that feel like they should be in the game, that's where we get more hate. But ultimately, the game is called Crusader Kings, not Muslim rulers. So I don't feel that necessarily if we put that into the kind of Mona Lisa DLC like we described, that's not necessarily a comparison that I feel is kind of fair. But it's perception is ultimately reality, and I think that the issue we have today, perhaps with a lot of people that are upset with the DLC model, is a lack of us explaining the rationale for why the model exists and what kind of additional value they get thanks to this model. A lot of people might simply not want it. Other people in the community complain that we just do too much stuff that's nice and they want everything but they can't afford it and we should stop doing stuff therefore. But I have a hard time getting behind that argument. I can, coming back to my original statement about the key metric of having a number in the main menu that tells you how much you spent per hour of entertainment, I think we should really do it every time the complaints become too loud. I even argue that we should increase the price of the game. And this is, of course, everyone just wants to shoot me when I say this. But arguably, if you bought Crusader Kings 6 years ago, it's a much, much, much better game today, and we're still only charging $40 for it. People go nuts when we don't lower the price of the game. I think we should raise it. It has arguably more value, and the concept of we should lower the price of things over time because it's old, it doesn't hold up to me. People, I think, look at how, and this is the reality. We have to deal with people's and players' behaviors and conditioning through other games, and then they apply that to the lens of our game. And it doesn't really jive to me. But again, I can't change perception and reality. I can just try to explain the model and show them how they get additional value. And I can, black and white, show why we would have never been able to create all this cool content if it wasn't for the fact that we'd created all the DLC.
Cool.
I don't think we don't have anything else to add to that. We'd be happy to take questions. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Henrik, and 2 years ago, Johan blamed me for your coding style. Sorry about that. I worked with him a long time ago. My question is, how do you manage QAing so many different combinations of the game?
Right, so the question is, how do we manage to QA so
Yes.
many different combinations of the game? Well, I don't have a perfect answer for you, except that our QA department is doing a really good job. But they have a smoke test protocol that they go through where they don't exactly try every combination of DLCs. That would be redundant because we're confident enough in the architecture that most of them will work together. But they have a protocol for that.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, I'm Oliver. I've really enjoyed Paradox games over the years. My question is, how do you plan for what you want your modders to be capable of, knowing that some of your community won't have all the expansions and the modders will probably be assuming you have all of the expansions? I know in my own mod work that I just click all the boxes. Yes, you must have this, this, and that. How do you plan for that?
All right, so if I understood you right, your question is, how do we plan for modders wanting to use features from all expansions or different expansions? Well, that's a really good question. We actually talk about it a lot right now. If we should, for example, have the cosmetic stuff be in the base game, so basically for free, but it's not shown in the game unless you have the expansion, right? So that's one approach, and I think we're moving towards that. So, for example, event pictures from expansions might be in the patch, in the base game, but you don't see them. But modders can use them then for whatever mod they want to do. So it's a complicated situation, if you will. We don't think further than that at the moment, but it is a good question.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.
Hello there. My question is, when working with other developers that, like for titles like Tyranny or Surviving Mars, how do you work with those studios to have the DLC model?
So the question was, how do we work with third-party studios when it comes to the business model and DLC model? So a bit of insight to how it works. We get about 1,000. I get about 1,000 pitches every year, and we say no to almost all of them. We end up maybe signing 5 games per year. The process that we have, obviously being a niche publisher, ends up saying we only do games that are RPG management or strategy games ultimately. Another factor is that we only work with people who buy into this and think this is a great way of working. We never try to force down IP or business models or culture or way of working with developers. But what we do is that we explain how we work and why we work that way. And if that's something that's attractive to people, they pitch and approach us on the same basis. And we learn from their experience and try to change it. So what we do is that we do more or less this talk, but we do it with each and every developer, and we do it many times over to try to help educate and help people understand why it's a more robust way of doing things. And especially for the development partner studios, this means that they'll be funded for 6 years working on a project, instead of like making a game and then hope it sells so they can keep working. This fundamentally gives more job security to the third-party developers that we work with. So it's hopefully they think it's an attractive model for that reason alone. But it's but ultimately we never sign a game unless it has this potential. There are exceptions. We published Pillars of Eternity with Obsidian, and it's a linear narrative story-driven game. And I said not every game lives up to the pillars perfectly, as the grand strategy games that these guys make. But we do exceptions for the benefit of thinking long term we'll be able to make a game that fits the game more. So Pillars of Eternity, while it doesn't match the pillars quite perfectly, the second game we made with Obsidian, Tyranny, we felt lived up to the pillars more and should be able to adapt to this business model better. But that didn't quite play out either. Turns out it's really expensive making RPGs.
Yeah. So happy to hear that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Rutger. I work at Abbey Games. We also make strategy games, so this sounds really interesting to us to be able to support the game for longer than we can do now. So I have experienced this new DLC model of yours. I bought Hearts of Iron 4 at launch, and I bought a few DLCs, the ones I liked.
Thank you.
And it worked. I felt it worked really well. But I was wondering how you can deal with, for example, players that come in late, basically, that enter the cycle halfway through.
Yeah.
I have experienced this myself with Europa Universalis. I was like, okay, I want to play this game, but there are so many things to choose from, and I don't know what to do, basically.
That's a great question. The question was, so what happens with the players that don't get on the train from the get-go when it's just $40 but get into it now? Somebody who comes to the Crusader Kings page, and this is a really good point. A lot of the hate, I think, comes from those people because they're just overwhelmed with what they're seeing. Because they've been conditioned, again, by other games that I'm getting an incomplete experience unless I buy the other stuff. But it's still a car you're getting. Leather seats is not a part of the core experience. That's the kind of comparison. And I think that there's an issue there, and this is something we talk to Steam to all the time about. How can we create product pages that more clearly explain to people what is necessary to be able to play the game? The most common thread I see on our subreddit is which expansions are essential. And I wish that people said you don't need to get any of them, they're optional. And that's the answer some of the times, but clearly you get a better Crusader Kings experience if you buy more expansions. We design it that way. But it's a good enough experience at that level. So in part, we need to do a better job of explaining this in our product pages. But another part of it is also, and this comes back to the business model. A lot of the times people come to the pages or when they want to buy a game, and this applies to anything we do, most of the time we've consciously made the decision that we want to buy the product. That's the main pain of actually making the purchase. We want to talk about psychology. Once somebody's made the choice and conscious effort that they want to buy the game, what they're then presented with, which of these different options will give me the greatest value? And if you're looking at one that is priced at about $280, which is the total of the CK2 DLCs, you kind of feel like, I can't afford that. That's too much. And you kind of feel like you're losing out. So there's another layer of psychological pain. But we do counter this by having frequent and quite deep discounts and sales through promotions. So that person that comes back and says, holy shit, everything is 75% off, they're buying that DLC, the total package that would have been $300 is much cheaper, but we're still making a healthy chunk of change. So one more question, they tell us, but we'll be available for questions outside afterwards.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Scott. I have a kind of similar question. You mentioned the phrase hard to learn, easy to master. Do you worry that with the infinite life cycle that you mentioned, that problem will just be exacerbated?
You asked, so the question was, do we think that the games become harder and harder to learn over time?
Yeah, as you add more and more features, even free ones, for example.
Yeah. No, that's an excellent question as well. And it's definitely true, right? But that's another reason to keep, to do like faction unlocks and to add new ways of playing that are preferably mutually exclusive with other ways of playing, rather than overloading players with so much stuff, right? So if you start as a pagan, it's still a manageable experience, and as you start as a Christian, it's also a manageable experience. But when you put all these things together, yeah, it's a rich game with a lot of different ways to play. So I prefer that way of doing things in general, and I think that we've gone a little bit too far with the stuff we've added to both CK2 and perhaps even more so EU4 over the years.
But you're correct in the fact that it's a greater challenge, and we need and do put more emphasis on learning, teaching out the game. The problem is, we created a tutorial one time, and perhaps the best example of where we failed horribly has been Crusader Kings 2, or even Victoria 2, I think, where everyone knew that the tutorial was broken, and you couldn't finish it for like a good 9 months, but we didn't do anything about it because that's not how people learn the game. They go on YouTube and watch Let's Play series. So it's been really lazy on our part.
Yeah, I mean, we've learned to do things properly with, I think, the Stellaris tutorial, which is a huge step forward.
Yes.
And that's the way we're going to do stuff from now on.
As well as in the future games that we do.
Thanks,
Cool,
guys.
thank you.
Love your
Thanks so
game.
much, guys.
Thanks.